So I'll talk from this part of the screen. So I'm going to talk about how to approach the writing of a comparative essay using the cause-response-consequence model, and how you could take it from an essay topic and then approach it on the exam day. So I'm going to start with one of the topics that I put on the comparative essay topics from VATE from months ago, and then go from there. So I'm going to look at this one. How do the crucible and the dressmaker explore the consequences of people being misled by appearances? And that's the key thing. Okay, that's the topic. I'm going to come back to this later and show you how to use this approach of breaking down a prompt and apply it to these. But I'll go to the other one and have a look. So what I've done here is I've taken the prompt here, or the topic, and I'm looking at how you could break it down in your response, in planning your response. So here is the topic. So I'm thinking, okay, so what would be my cause, my response, and my consequence? What would it be focused on? Well, I'd be thinking, in my cause, I'd like to establish what the problem is, and then I would like to engage with that. So what you could be thinking about here is perhaps being misled by appearances. How are you establishing that? So you're talking about the misled by appearances. You might want to start with that in this particular topic, and so you could start with that, misled by appearances. Now you could be talking about the consequences of people in that opening. You talk about kind of what were the consequences down the track, but you could really focus, if you wanted to, start on misled by appearances. So in that cause, you could be talking about what are the notions of appearances and misled as established in the text. Who does the misleading key moments to show it or to explore it that you can actually talk about? So a way you could do it is by having Abigail, talking about Abigail who's misleading with manipulating appearances, and Pettyman. You could start with that if you wanted to. And then the next thing you could say is, okay, so response. How do the writers explore the effect caused by the misleading of others when manipulating appearances through the text? So through the text. You're talking about how the composer is exploring it through the text. And then think about who suffers the consequences or ramifications, because you can always use synonyms in a response. So you could actually have ramifications here, because it's similar meaning to consequences. So you could explore that through Proctor, the townspeople, Mary Warren, Molly, Tilly, Marigold, Pennyman. You can do through one of them if you wanted to. Because I've been looking at this topic, and you could talk about misled by appearances to start with the cause, and then the consequences. And that's what you could do in the response. You're talking about how they're exploring it through the text. And then the consequence is, what are the consequences of the deception? So you could talk about Abigail losing Proctor and her position in society, the impact of Abigail's deception on Elizabeth Proctor, or Mary Warren, or John Proctor, Tilly being damaged and hurt all her life, leading to her final actions and lifelong hatred, or the three-pronged impact of Evan Pettyman's lies on three women. Right, so that's what you could be maybe thinking about in your consequences. But in that consequence, you need to be thinking about also final messages, because I would assume through any of these, you would be talking about the author intention, all those sorts of things. But as a base, you can start with this. But author intention you can really do too as well, because what I've got there, that's the base level. If cause, response, consequence, at its kind of basic level, you could think of it this way. But then I'm going to show you then, if you want to make it a bit more complex, I'm going to show you a work through introduction and plan. So this is an introduction that I could write for this particular response, or this particular topic, I should say. One of the unifying social phenomena connecting the disparate worlds of Miller's Crucible and Ham's The Dressmaker is that of the cynical building of mendacious and hypocritical facades that are connected to the role of women in society. I'm actually going to focus on that part. In both texts, the writers place characters in a position where they create an appearance designed to give the person behind the facade more power, thus providing them with the opportunity to mislead others for their own personal gain. So I am engaging with the prompt. You notice here I haven't named any characters. And there's a reason for that, because sophisticated introduction for the most part doesn't name characters. They both do this to demonstrate the dramatic and often heartbreaking consequences of facade creation and the power wielded by those with nefarious motives. Nefarious, of course, meaning almost villainous, or certainly selfish, uncaring kind of motives. While the texts differ, however, is in comments about women in society through those storylines. With Ham, it is about a dramatic and darkly karmic conclusion, which I'm going to argue, making a feminist commentary on the place of women in society. For Miller, there are also comments on the role of women in society, but his intent is not as comic, or as inherently feminist. So I'm going to make that argument, because I'm going to talk about the intent and so forth. But if that is not your go, if you're not really still, if the composer intent is still kind of a little bit challenging for you, there's still chance in this model to still look at other things. But I'm just telling you, this is something, give that next level of sophistication. So in my paragraph 1, my cause paragraph, in this one, I would say, who creates the misleading appearances and why? And that's what pretty much my focus. But also talk about the misleading appearances in general. So I would be maybe talking about Abigail being provided with a near impossible task to escape the consequences of her open expression of desire for Proctor. Discuss the nature of her deception, harnessing the collective power of bullying less confident girls. But I would be foregrounding it with this. So I'm taking that. So I'll be thinking about that in my particular response. So that's what I'll be thinking about, and then talking about the rest of it, talking about the examples. And so that's what you could be doing with the opening. But you can do a number of different things. If you're talking about the need, see, I'd be thinking about this question. I'd be talking about, but why do you need appearances? What are the authors saying with the appearances? So if I'm looking at this, I'm talking about this sort of thing, but I'd actually be thinking about the why being important. So that's the thing. That's start thinking about. So, place of women in society, suggesting that they need to present a particular facade for a particular purpose. Specifically, when they go outside the bounds of expected behaviour. And so that's the thing. So that's because I'm suggesting that she's provided with a near impossible task to escape the consequences of her open desire, expression of desire for Proctor. Because the thing is, that's kind of prompting her actions. So that's the way I'd be arguing it. So, and then I'd be talking about that. So this one here, then I'll be talking about Pettyman. So creating a facade of respectability mixed with charm that helped him gain a political office and access to money and social status through Marigold, harnessing the social demands placed on women who are pregnant outside marriage, placed Marigold as someone in a similar position position to Abigail in terms of choices. Now, so Ham commenting on Australia's aspirational and political culture and the place of women in that society is what I'm saying about the author. So I am taking that and I'm going to put it here. So I'm just going to put that brackets in there. So I'm actually, that's what I'm going to talk about there, is because it's that whole notion you're talking about. So I need to be talking about here misled by appearances, but what causes that? What causes the need? What causes the conditions where that happens? So, and then you've got here, then you could talk about that sort of thing. Okay, so that's how establishing the misleading of appearances. All right, and then what you could do here is that I would maybe throw in a contrast point. So, one thing you need to be doing this is what you'll see is there's the comparison here is you're talking about the place of women in society. Okay, that's what you're talking about here, and that's the similarity. They're talking about the place of women in society, and also I would say that this one here, the lack of choice for women. So you're thinking about that as a comparison point as well. So you could say that there's a lack of limit. Both of them have limitations because she made the mistake of openly expressing her love for Proctor, which means that she's constantly vulnerable. And this person here, Marigold, this woman here, she got pregnant out of marriage, which is what happens to her. So that's what I'll be thinking about, some comparison points, but also a contrast point. So Abigail and Pettyman's power dynamic. So I'm actually thinking you could do Abigail and Pettyman comparison, where you're talking about their power dynamic is different. Abigail's is more precarious and threatened the rules regarded by women. Pettyman seems more unassailable in his appearances and power due to the place of women in society, especially from a respectable upbringing. But you could actually, if you wanted to, you could kind of do a Abigail Marigold Pettyman comparison. But I mean, there's different ways you can go. But what I'm suggesting is you need to have this idea of being able to look at some comparison points, and you're talking about misleading appearances, and then you should also think about some contrast points. All right. So the next thing you could do is, now in the response, you could talk about the development and ramifications of the misleading events, appearances. I'm just going to say appearances here, aren't we? So you could even talk about the life and position of Mary Warren as a young girl in Salem, having to buckle under the demands of Abigail and Danforth, and the knock-on effect of that, which is to talk about then the effect on Proctor, right? But the thing is here again, I've got the point I'm trying to make here, the sort of the author goal. So So the thing is that I already thinking about how does the emotional impact of this kind of deception have. So I'd be thinking about Mary Warren and thinking about that terrible position she's placed in by Abigail, where she needs to conform to Abigail's deceptive actions in order to stay connected to her the other young women in the community. All of them felt as though they needed to conform, and so Miller is actually making a comment on that reality. And so now I'll be thinking about Precarious, and let's think about that whole idea about Precarious. So I'll be thinking about the Dressmaker, the abuse and the dark awakening of Marigold, the psychologically disturbing confronted with Evan, appears to be a darkly honed triumph. It is not acting as an indictment of the impact of abusive men on women, or the impact of Tilly losing her childhood, resulting in a disconnect with Molly that robs her of that relationship, and results in an emotionally charged scene between Molly and Tilly. So the thing is this one, right? I would actually suggest here that what you could do is compare with Mary Warren, in terms of how precarious and vulnerable women are to being affected profoundly by deception, and those who act to mislead. So you actually be thinking about that too, and so that's something, because I like the idea of precarious, because they've got the women in both texts are fairly precarious. Now, that's the way you can do it. And then here, the contrast point: the consequences take a different tone due to the different purposes of the writers in regards to their purposes, with Miller's focus being on the indictment of a system that would place insecure, precarious young women in a place, position of power, as opposed to Ham's searing indictment on abusive men and the emotional impact of the abuse that can lead to the actions of Tilly and Marigold. So yes, while their actions are the precarious sort of natures, but the whole difference is this: in the Miller text, you see, because Mary Warren, well, how's she affected? She's actually really badly affected in the end, because she's made her decision, and after the play, you don't know what happened to her, and I'm always sometimes I wonder what happened to her. But the whole thing is that Ham gives Tilly and Marigold a way of freeing themselves and having power, and they basically and so you got that where Ham gives them power. So I mean, that's what I'll be maybe thinking about in that particular thing. But my point about this is that you're thinking about things in common, but in the response, you're talking about how things are developed through a text. And then the last one, the consequence, is the consequences and takeaway comments from the writers. So think about this: the consequences for the women in the Crucible, the consequences for Elizabeth Proctor due to Abigail's deception. You can be talking about that. Or the Miller's commentary on the future of women like Abigail, so it's consequences of misleading and all that sort of thing. Shows a glimpse into the limitations of being a disgraced woman in that time, because that's certainly what's... Abigail really hasn't got much of a future if she's going to get shunned from her own community for what she did, because all the stuff about Proctor would have come out. And so what's her options? Not many. So it's saying that that's what the options were for women. Some people think that's sexist. Other people might say, well, it's a reflection of the time. That's really up for conjecture and discussion. But then also even the impact on Mary Warren. She hasn't got an employer. She might be completely connected with Abigail. Certainly people would not respect her and maybe listen to her more. That's an interesting idea too. That's a speculation. But if you're thinking about that, she's definitely tied herself to that. But then think about the consequences of women connected to Evan Pettyman. So, a deceitful man leading to the abuse of women who had limited power. The commentary from Ham through the ends of the storyline: Marigold, Molly and Tilly. So think about that and talk about the three of them and what they have in common. Is because the thing is that all of them are bitter and sad. And while there's some fiery reaction of Marigold and Tilly, while they're humorous or but they're still there to leave a bitter taste to the reader, because there's someone like Tilly who's burnt down her whole childhood home, but she's also burnt down all those dresses she's made. And so there's a certain sadness to that, but also even the way kind of Farrett is kind of left behind. So it's basically even the good bits about her time in Dungatar are kind of burnt as well. So if you think about it, it still leaves that bitter taste, and it's basically the bitterness is what you're left with in the impact of Pettyman's lies and deception. And then you've got, of course, Marigold as well. Well, her ultimate fate of being taken away to the sanatorium, mental institution, said, "Oh, I'll be fine." But that's still not a great life. It still means that her life has been ruined by an abusive man. So that's what you need to be thinking about: the consequences of these women being their lives being ruined by the actions of an abusive and deceptive man. Going back to your prompt, talking about right back at the beginning, consequences of people being misled by appearances. So there's a lot going on, of course, in this. This is a kind of next level up. But this is the way you could do a cause-response consequence if you wanted to be more sophisticated. But I'm going to leave this on your teams. But just to tell you, this is what you can do with the planning for a cause response consequence. So now I'm going to show you the next part, which is to how to apply this to other questions. Okay, so I'm going to talk about other questions here. So if you were to look at any of these questions, if you wanted to break them down, now this is not to say you have to break it down this way, and there's some people who will break it down their own natural way. But if you're struggling, this is for people who are really struggling and trying to think, how am I going to approach these? You could be thinking about these particular topics in a cause, response, consequence kind of way. So, for example, you could, in this particular one, you could be focusing on insular worldviews, and in your cause, you could be establishing what are insular worldviews, how are they kind of established, what are they in common between the two texts. You could start with that, and then in your response, you could be talking about examine the impact. So you could talk about how do the texts kind of work on that impact and discuss that impact through the text. What is in the way that the characters respond to the problem. So you could say, to think of it that way, you could be talking about, I mean, you could talk about all of this here, but it's certainly a way you could be thinking about it. So, but you need to establish what the insular worldviews are, and then you're thinking about, okay, so how they examine the impact. So you could start with the cause, you could have a little bit of examine the impact, but then you could say, well, through the text, you can do more of that. Because in this one here, the cause, you're thinking about individual differences and then social norms. So you're thinking about that, well, what are you establishing? What are the social norms? And then how are these characters, being constrained? That's something you could be talking about in your response paragraph. In something like this, you could be talking about judgment as your cause, and then forgiveness as being a response to judgment. Maybe, if you wanted to do that, if you want to do a cause and effect kind of relationship, you could do that. And then one thing you could do here, I'll just go down here, the heart of human nature is very dark. That sort of question is a little bit different, because you could be talking about the heart of human nature. You could say that, what are the problems in that are explored in those texts, and then how do characters respond. So that's kind of way you could approach it. But the whole thing is, you do need a holistic approach. So in your introductions, you need to be sort of doing the whole thing. But if you're finding it really challenging to think, okay, how am I doing a cause, response, consequence? What am I talking about? That's a possible way you could approach. Those particular prompts. It is a suggestion, but it is not a be-all and end-all. And so that's just the way you could do it if you wish to. I hope this video is helpful, and please book a time with me and we can talk about the next step.